That night in Gangnam seemed written for brilliance. The golden chandeliers cast reflections on crystal glasses. The expensive scent of flowers mingled with the sound of calculated laughter, and every glance in the room seemed to measure value, not feelings. At the center of the celebration, Yoon Tae-jin raised his glass in a triumphant toast, surrounded by executives who admired him as a man who had conquered everything. Beside him, Soo-min silently watched her husband with the same love that once made her endure nights of solitude, forgotten promises, and a home that had become a showcase. Her smile, restrained and polite, hid the weight of years spent in her husband's shadow, the woman who sustained the empire but no longer held a place in his heart. Between toasts, someone praised her patience, and Tae-jin, in a cruel joke, responded with a laugh. Patient. Soo-min's so quiet. Sometimes I forget she's there. His laughter echoed loudly, mingling with the guests' laughter, while her face remained serene, even as her heart shattered inside. The wine in her glass trembled, reflecting a crimson hue that seemed to portend the end. In that moment, something was erased. The love, the hope, the innocence of someone who believed she was seen. And as he celebrated yet another victory, she silently swore that this would be the last time she would let him forget her. But what happens when someone who was invisible decides to be remembered in the most unexpected way possible? If this story touched something in you, subscribe now and leave a like, because what comes next will prove that even the quietest love can become unforgettable. The next morning, the sun filtered through the silk curtains of the apartment in Seoul, but the brightness that invaded the room seemed to find no one to welcome its light. The silence was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, and the clock on the wall marked time with painful slowness. Yoon Tae-jin, still drowsy, reached out across the bed, hoping to find the familiar touch of Soo-min, but the sheet was cold, and the other side of the bed remained untouched, as if no one had slept there. He got up unhurriedly, calling for her once, twice, 3 times, but the house returned only the hollow echo of his own voice. The breakfast table was set, the aroma of tea still lingered in the air, and on the plate lay a small white envelope. Inside it was a brief letter, written in the soft handwriting he knew well, which simply said, "You won't notice my absence now, but one day she will be the only thing you see." For a moment he stood still, holding the paper with the same incredulity of someone witnessing the impossible. He walked through the house, as if searching for traces of something that might still remain, but the closet was empty, the shelves stripped of perfumes and mementos, and the photograph of the 2 of them on the piano had disappeared, leaving only a clear trace of its location. Tae-jin tried to rationalize, telling himself that perhaps she had gone to visit her parents or needed some time to herself, but deep down, something inside him knew this absence was different. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and then the rumors began. The press, always eager for stories that tarnished the luster of the powerful, published headlines hinting at a marital crisis. CEO's wife disappears without a trace. In the hallways of H Group, curious glances multiplied. Some watched him with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of seeing an empire falter behind its surface. He feigned control, repeating that all was well, but on nights when the city slept, the memory of that last night haunted him with the weight of a curse he himself had invoked. The apartment that once held dinners, laughter, and her sweet perfume had become a cold space, filled with memories that ached silently. Tae-jin walked through the rooms, feeling that every corner held her invisible presence. Soo-min, as if she were there, watching him slowly learn the value of what he'd lost. The arrogance that had sustained him began to crumble, and for the first time, The man who used to dominate rooms and crowds felt small before his own reflection. There was something terribly familiar about that feeling. The invisibility he'd imposed on her was now turning against him, making him the veritable ghost in his own home. But fate is not content to teach gently. The disappearance of Lee Soo-min would be just the first sign of a much bigger turn, a silent storm that was approaching with subtle steps and that would soon show the Yoon Tae-jin that time has a cruel way of returning everything that pride has destroyed. Before becoming the invisible woman in her husband's eyes, Lee Soo-min, she had been a radiant young woman, full of dreams and hopes. Time seemed to pass at a gentle pace in the early years of their relationship, when they both still believed that love was enough to sustain any burden. She met him in a small coffee shop near the university, when he was still just an ambitious student in a cheap suit and a determined look. Tae-jin, with his natural charisma, spoke passionately about the future and the company he would one day found, while Soo-min listened enchanted, admiring that inner fire that seemed to burn beyond reason. He was the kind of man who turned promises into plans, and she, the kind of woman who believed that loving was the same as caring. In the early years of their marriage, she became his silent rock, the one who motivated him on difficult days and held him when the pressures of work threatened to consume him. While Tae-jin built the empire that would make him known throughout Seoul, Soo-min left behind his own design projects, the exhibitions he dreamed of opening, and the invitations to teach art at universities. Gradually, the creative and expressive woman transformed into a calm, discreet presence, shaped by the routine that revolved around him. The apartment was an extension of her dedication: fresh flowers on the table, lovingly prepared dinners, impeccable suits on the bed. Everything seemed perfect, at least to the outsider. But inside her, love began to mix with a bittersweet feeling of emptiness. On nights when he arrived late, she would lie awake waiting for the elevator to sound, only to see him enter absent-mindedly, respond with short sentences, and disappear into his office. It was in this daily silence that her heart, Soo-min, began to fall apart. She spoke, but was not heard. She cried, but no one understood. She existed, but only as a detail in the life of a man who no longer saw her. His gaze, once full of desire and admiration, now passed through her as if through a mirror. One night, while trying to talk, she heard something from him she would never forget. "Soo-min, you worry too much about nonsense. I need focus, not drama." It was in that sentence that she understood that the love that had brought them together had become a burden he carried by habit, not by choice. So, amidst the emptiness of a house too big to house two strangers, she began to fall silent. And the silence, like a slow disease, spread through the rooms until it dominated everything. The past, once a shelter, had become an emotional prison. And while Tae-jin climbed the ladder of success, Soo-min sank deeper and deeper into an invisible loneliness, unaware that this oblivion would be the guiding thread of her transformation. The love that once made her small would soon be the same one that taught her to rise, and no one, not even he, would be prepared to see what would rise from the ashes of that oblivion. 3 years have passed since the disappearance of Lee Soo-min, and although the world still called him a genius, Yoon Tae-jin, he no longer recognized himself in the reflection he saw in the mirror every morning. The luxurious penthouse that had once been the scene of dinners and celebrations was now nothing more than a silent space, filled with memories that echoed in every corner. The corporate success that had once fueled his ego now weighed like a cold crown on the head of a king without a kingdom. Meetings continued, contracts were signed, and camera flashes still haunted him, But nothing seemed to have color anymore. The man who once dominated entire rooms with his presence now lost himself in long, vague thoughts, as if searching for something his own pride had prevented him from achieving. At night, Tae-jin would walk the hallways of the dark apartment, touching the walls as if trying to sense the presence that had once lived there. Soo-min's clothes were gone, her perfumes were gone, but the emptiness had a scent. He could feel it in the air, in the distant sounds of the city, in the way the wind blew against the windows. Sometimes he imagined he heard the soft sound of her footsteps, and for brief moments he believed that if he turned quickly enough, he would still find her there, watching him with that serene gaze that judged him without words. But a blink was all it took to realize I was alone. The invisibility he had imposed on his wife had now become its own curse. Those around him began to notice the change. His assistants saw him arriving earlier and later. The firm voice that once commanded respect now sounded distant, as if he was speaking to an audience that no longer existed. Investors, accustomed to his relentless energy, noticed his absent look during meetings, as if his mind were in another time. At home, the dust-covered piano was the same one where Soo-min used to play soft music in the late afternoons. And in moments of desperation, Tae-jin would sit in front of it, pressing the keys haphazardly, just to hear the sound of something still vibrating. No matter how hard he tried, success no longer filled the void. The interviews he gave felt like rehashed scripts, and the words of admiration sounded like echoes of a lie that no longer sustained him. He was a man surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted, but stripped of everything that truly mattered. Time, once his ally, had now become the cruel mirror that forced him to confront his own regret. And though he feigned control, he knew deep down that the absence of Soo-min wasn't just a wound. It was the beginning of a silent punishment that was far from over. And fate, with its relentless precision, was preparing something that would soon force him to face not only the weight of loneliness, but the unexpected return of the woman he believed he had erased forever. As time moved on, like a silent tide, Yoon Tae-jin tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. He immersed himself in reports, meetings, and speeches, pretending that success still had a flavor. However, behind the panoramic windows of his office in Yeouido, the city seemed to watch him ironically, as if it knew something in him had broken forever. It was in the midst of this automatic routine that a name began to circulate in the corporate corridors of Seoul, a name that at first seemed harmless but soon sparked unease among big businessmen, A Group. Within a few months, the new company emerged onto the economic scene like an unexpected storm. Young, bold, and driven by an ideal that blended empathy and innovation, Chae Group conquered space in areas that previously belonged exclusively to T Group. Their campaigns spoke modernly, their strategies were distinctive, and their products seemed born of a human purpose that contrasted with the market's coldness. Investors commented with admiration, while rivals watched with suspicion. Tae-jin, for his part, feigned disinterest, but every time he saw that name plastered across headlines, he felt an unease grow within him, as if a familiar shadow were approaching. During a meeting, one of its directors enthusiastically commented, "Hae Group is revolutionizing the market, Mr. Yoon. They say their motto is leadership that sees people. It sounds simple, but it's captivating the public." Tae-jin frowned. The phrase echoed in his mind with an unexplainable discomfort. There was something about that philosophy that felt like an indirect, almost personal provocation, as if someone had decided to poke at the wound he'd been trying to hide for years. The following weeks were marked by discreet but consistent losses. Old contracts began to migrate to HAE Group. Long-standing partnerships dissolved, and investor confidence wavered. At first, Tae-jin thought it was a coincidence. But when he saw the first comparative reports between the two companies, the similarity in methods disturbed him. The management tactics, the leadership posture, even the campaign structure, everything seemed a refined reflection of his own way of working. It was as if someone had taken the best of him, stripped away the pride, and given a soul to what had previously been just profit. That night, alone in his office, Tae-jin watched the reflected lights of Seoul from above. The city seemed to pulse differently, and on the horizon, an uneasy feeling grew. Something was coming his way. No matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, he knew there was something deeply personal behind this mysterious company. The name Hay Group echoed in his mind like a memory about to reveal itself, and instinct, the one that had once guided him to the top, now warned him that the past was about to knock on his door. And when the past decides to return, it never arrives quietly. The air in Seoul felt heavier that late afternoon. Traffic moved slowly. LED billboards advertised the biggest corporate event of the year, the International Asian Innovation Conference, where the market's leading names would present their visions for the future. At the top of the guest list was Yoon Tae-jin, the man still considered one of the most brilliant minds in the business world. Even with the last few months marked by discrete losses, his reputation remained intact, and the public expected to hear from him a speech of strength and reinvention. But inside him, nothing resembled the leader of old. He dressed in his suit with the same precision as always, adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, and for a moment stared at his own reflection like someone observing a stranger, trying to remember who they once were. The auditorium of the COEX Center was packed. White lights cut through the room, and the sound of flashbulbs created a tense symphony between the buzz of the press and the clink of champagne glasses. When Tae-jin's name was announced, the audience gave him a standing ovation, and he took the stage with the measured gait of someone who has learned to hide emptiness beneath an erect posture. His words flowed confidently, but something in his voice sounded too rehearsed, too distant, as if his soul had been left behind. He spoke of overcoming obstacles, of new goals, and of how Group was ready to embrace a new era. It was a nice but lifeless line. And then something happened. As soon as he finished, the host smiled and announced the evening's next guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of HAE Group, the woman who is transforming leadership in the global marketplace with a vision rooted in empathy and human innovation, Soo-min. For a second, time seemed to dissolve. Tae-jin remained motionless, the microphone still in his hand, but the sound of his own heart began to pound in his ears. The audience erupted in applause, and the lights swung. Toward the side entrance, a figure emerged in the glare of the spotlights, serene, elegant, draped in a white dress that reflected the light like a mirror. Her hair was darker now, her gaze more steady, and her expression, once sweet and restrained, exuded self-confidence. It was Soo-min. For a moment, the world seemed to spin slowly, and all Tae-jin could hear was the muffled sound of his own breathing. Each step she took toward the stage seemed to echo like thunder, marking the rhythm of a destiny he never imagined he would encounter again. When she took the microphone, the smile she offered the audience was subtle, controlled, almost enigmatic. But when their eyes met, he knew. Nothing about this woman resembled the wife he had called invisible. "Good afternoon, Mr. Yoon. It is an honor to meet you again in this new time." Her tone was calm, respectful, but each word carried the weight of a silent irony, as if the entire universe were applauding her for that moment. Tae-jin tried to muster a smile, but his face betrayed him. The audience, oblivious to the invisible drama unfolding before them, continued to vibrate with Soo-min's inspiring speech. She spoke about human values, about the importance of seeing people beyond profits, about how the future of companies lay in looking into the eyes of those who build the dream. Each sentence was a reminder, a wound elegantly opened before everyone. Tae-jin watched, unable to react. His body felt hot, his hands sweating, his heart pounding. This woman hadn't just returned, she'd been reborn before the world, wearing the success he believed he possessed alone. With her every word, the audience applauded, and his pride shattered in silence. When she stepped off the stage, their eyes met again, and what he saw wasn't hatred or revenge. It was something far worse, indifference. She passed by him as if she were truly invisible, giving him back without a word the same pain he had once caused her. And as she walked away, amidst applause and flashbulbs, Tae-jin understood that the true punishment wasn't the loss, but the reunion with what he'd destroyed. The past hadn't returned just to remind him of his mistake, but to rewrite in front of everyone the role he once thought he'd mastered alone. But fate wasn't finished with its show yet, for what Tae-jin had just witnessed was only the first act of a silent revenge that would unfold far beyond that night. The conference had ended, but the impact of that reunion hung in the air like a scent impossible to ignore. Yoon Tae-jin had left the stage to cold applause, moving between automatic greetings and rehearsed smiles, while his mind was buzzing with the presence of Soo-min, now the most talked-about woman at the event. In every face that approached him, he noticed something new, admiration mixed with curiosity, as if everyone knew a new force had emerged, threatening the throne he believed eternal. The mere mention of the name High Group made him uneasy, and even the praise directed at him sounded hollow, like echoes of a past that no longer held any prestige. That same night, during the leadership cocktail party, Tae-jin saw her again, surrounded by investors and journalists. She spoke with serene elegance, her firm, soft voice commanding the room, and every word seemed charged with purpose. Dressed in black, with a discreet necklace around her neck, Soo-min radiated the confidence of someone who knows their own worth. He watched from a distance, unable to look away, and for the first time he felt he was now the one in the shadow. When their eyes finally met, the world seemed to slow down. She held his gaze for a moment, without a smile, without anger, only with the sharp indifference of someone who has already understood the power of their own silence. That single second was enough to dismantle all the arrogance that remained in him. In the following days, strategic movements began. HTE Group announced merger proposals. In sectors that previously belonged exclusively to H Group, winning international contracts and the support of influential figures. Soo-min's name appeared in business magazines, interviews and conferences, while Tae-jin's image began to tarnish. At an internal meeting, he heard from one of the directors, "Maybe we should study the HAE Group leadership model. They seem to understand something we've forgotten." He responded firmly, trying to preserve the authority that was already slipping from his grasp, but inside, every word corroded him. He knew that something was precisely what he had destroyed years ago, the ability to see people beyond the numbers. In a bold move, Tae-jin decided to propose a formal partnership between the two companies, disguised as a strategic collaboration, but actually driven by a personal need to confront the past. The meeting took place in a glass conference room atop a skyscraper that reflected the entire city. When Soo-min entered, the atmosphere changed. She sat across from him, calmly folded her hands and waited. He began the conversation with a corporate speech, talking about opportunities, innovation, and mutual growth, but his voice betrayed anxiety. She listened to him to the end, silently, and then responded calmly, "Interesting. You talk about the future, but all I hear is fear." Tae-jin's gaze was lost for a moment. Her words pierced the veneer of control, revealing the wound he'd tried to hide. In that moment, he understood that the true battlefield was no longer the market, but pride. And as she stood to end the meeting, a faint smile crossed her face. A smile without joy, just the certainty of someone who's leading the game. But what he didn't know yet was that this would be just the first movement of a silent war, where the past would collect every debt with surgical precision, and where forgotten love would become the most powerful weapon of all. As the weeks went by, Yoon Tae-jin began to realize that something deeper was going on behind the scenes of the rivalry between the companies. It wasn't just a fight for contracts or recognition. There was a strategic intelligence behind the meteoric rise of Hey Group, a sequence of moves so precise it seemed to have been mapped out by someone who knew his every weakness. He spent entire nights in the office, surrounded by reports and graphs, trying to understand how the new competitor could predict his every decision with such accuracy. At each emergency meeting, he discovered that yet another of his projects had been overtaken, and each loss seemed carefully calculated to hurt not only his company, but also his ego. Determined to find out who was behind this invisible mechanism, Tae-jin ordered an internal investigation. He demanded reports on hiring, meetings, and contracts signed over the past few years. And it was then, amidst the seemingly ordinary data, that something stopped him cold. Many of the names listed as HAE Group executives had worked at H Group, people he himself had dismissed, belittled, or ignored at one time. Talented men and women who for years had felt invisible under his command. Now they were all on her side. This wasn't coincidence, it was calculation. As he delved deeper into the investigation, Tae-jin began to discern the contours of a web woven with patience and precision. This wasn't just corporate revenge, but a meticulous reconstruction of what had once been destroyed. He found archived emails, old messages from disengaged employees, records of meetings where he had dismissed ideas that now, ironically, underpinned HAE Group's success. The realization hit him hard. Soo-min, she had learned everything from observing him, his methods, his flaws, his weaknesses, and now she used every bit of that knowledge against him, not with shouting or scandal, but with the calculated coldness of someone who has mastered the art of silence. One particularly long night, sitting in his office, he gazed out. At the illuminated city, his own reflection in the glass seeming to mock him. He remembered the times he'd disregarded Soo-min's suggestions, the times he'd dismissed her ideas so as not to share the credit, the times he'd treated her as a mere spectator. Now it all came back in gigantic proportions, an inverted mirror where she, once dim, had become the dazzling light. The irony of fate was almost poetic, but there was no beauty in feeling destroyed by one's own creation. When days later he received the final report of the investigation, the last page contained a recent photograph, Soo-min at an international conference, surrounded by former H Group employees, smiling alongside names he himself had dismissed. The caption was simple: "The invisible are now seen." He remained staring at that image for long minutes, feeling the weight of the past closing in on him like a trap. And as he stared into the serene face of the woman he had once called his shadow, Tae-jin realized that this power play was only just beginning, and that the next time they met, she would no longer come to prove a point, but to teach him what it meant to lose everything pride had kept him from loving. The rain fell heavily over Seoul that night, drawing silvery lines on the glass of the skyscrapers. The sound of thunder mixed with the distant echo of traffic, creating a dense, almost prophetic atmosphere. Inside the car, Yoon Tae-jin watched the city through the fogged windows as the wipers cut through. The darkness with mechanical movements. The phone rested on the seat next to it, the last message still lit on the screen. An unexpected invitation to an emergency meeting at the company's headquarters. HAE Group. No name, just the address and the time. He hesitated for a moment, but something inside him, perhaps pride, perhaps necessity, urged him to go. Upon arriving, the HAE building loomed before him like a modern fortress, shrouded in cold lights and metallic reflections. He entered, unannounced, and the security guards strangely didn't stop him. The elevator doors closed, and as he ascended, the reflection of his own image in the steel mirror seemed to question him. What did he hope to find there? Forgiveness, explanation, or simply the weight of what he had sown years ago? The sound of the elevator stopping on the top floor roused him from his thoughts. When the doors opened, the corridor was silent, and at the end, a large glass wall revealed the stormlit city. Before that view, motionless, he stood, Soo-min. She didn't turn around immediately. She seemed to contemplate the horizon with the calm of someone who already knew the outcome. The room was lit only by the pale light of lightning, which outlined her profile as if the night itself paid homage to the moment that was approaching. Tae-jin took a few hesitant steps, each one heavier than the last. When he finally stopped, his voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. So that's it. It was you all along. She turned slowly, and the look she gave him held neither hatred nor resentment, but an almost sacred distance, as if she were seeing him through a curtain of memories. I warned you, Tae-jin. I said one day you would understand what it's like to be invisible, but I didn't imagine it would take this long. The sentence echoed in the room with the force of thunder. He tried to move closer, but the air between them felt too thick. Why all this, Soo-min? Why destroy what we've built? She took a deep breath, and her voice, though calm, carried the pain of years condensed in every syllable. Destroy? I only rebuilt what you broke. You built an empire of concrete and pride, and I built another, of purpose and soul. The difference is that mine doesn't need to erase you to exist. He fell silent. The sound of rain hitting the glass was the only witness. The tears streaming down his face mingled with the cold water still dripping from his wet hair. I was an idiot, Soo-min. I lost you because I didn't know how to see. I erased you because I was afraid of your light. She watched him, and for a brief moment, something in her gaze wavered, not pity but remembrance. He walked over and said, in a barely audible tone, "And now, who's invisible?" The words pierced his heart like a blade. Tae-jin, weak, knelt before her, not like a man begging for forgiveness, but like someone finally aware of his own ruin. The distant sound of thunder drowned out the suppressed sobs that escaped. Soo-min looked away, unable to contemplate what remained of the man she once loved. For a few seconds, time seemed suspended. She walked to the window, and a flash of lightning illuminated her face, serene, but marked by an ancient sadness. I didn't come back for revenge, Tae-jin. I came back to free myself from the burden of forgiving you. The sentence hung in the air, severing the last link between them. He stood there, kneeling, as she walked to the door. As the sound of her heels echoed down the hallway, he felt like each step was a final sentence. The rain outside began to ease, but inside him, the storm was just beginning. And although he believed that was the last time he would see her, Yoon Tae-jin, I didn't yet know that fate doesn't end stories with silence. It only sets the stage for the deepest punishment of all. The months following the confrontation were silent, but the silence this time had the sound of falling. Yoon Tae-jin, once seen as a symbol of leadership and genius, began to lose everything that sustained it, not abruptly, but with the painful slowness of a rope unraveling fiber by fiber. The first blow came with the departure of one of the company's main investors, H Group, followed by a series of quiet defections. Contracts began to be cancelled, and market confidence evaporated as easily as he had once dismissed the people around him. In every headline, there was a cruel irony. The same magazines that had once plastered his face with admiration were now talking about the decline of the Yoon Empire. As the company sank, Tae-jin became a shadow of his former self. He spent hours locked in his office, surrounded by folders and memories that no longer made sense. He tried to fix what was falling apart before his eyes. But what was crumbling wasn't the numbers. It was his name, his prestige, his respect. The empty looks of his employees, the once energetic hallways now filled with tense silence, the sound of phones that no longer rang, everything had become a bitter mirror of the indifference he once offered the woman who loved him. About that, Soo-min continued to grow. The high group established itself as a benchmark for ethics and innovation, and she, always discreet, refused interviews that mentioned the past. She never mentioned his name, never celebrated his downfall, because she knew the true punishment wasn't destruction, but conscience. Her success was the most painful reflection Tae-jin could face. One night, he looked out his office window at the HJE building. The lights overhead formed its name amid the fog, and for the first time, he understood that life had taken it upon itself to return, with surgical precision, everything he had sown. Karma doesn't shout, it doesn't rush. It watches, it waits, and when it arrives, it teaches. But destiny still held one last meeting in store, one that would not be born of pain, but rather of what she had always carried in silence. The compassion that is born when the wound finally heals. That night, the sky of alone, it seemed cleaner than usual, as if even the city itself was waiting for an outcome. The lights of the metropolis reflected on the wet asphalt, and the distant sound of cars mingled with the murmur of the wind blowing through the avenues. Soo-min, dressed with the same elegant sobriety that always accompanied her, walked alone through the streets that once saw her disappear. Each step was a memory, each corner a fragment of the past that, little by little, stopped hurting. She stopped in front of a restaurant in Gangnam, the same place where it all began. For a moment she hesitated, as if time had bent before her, bringing back the night she was erased with a single word. She entered silently. The waiter, who no longer recognized her, led her to a table near the window, the same one where she had sat years before, invisible to the eyes of a man who believed he ruled the world. She observed the room serenely. Glasses clinked, laughter filled the air, and the scent of wine and memories mingled in an almost poetic way. She ordered a glass of the same wine from that night, and as the red liquid ran down the glass, she felt that somehow the cycle was closing. Time had not erased the pain, but had transformed it into wisdom. She looked up and murmured to herself in the soft voice of one speaking to the past. Love without respect is but a broken mirror, and for so long I tried to see myself in shards. As she savored her wine, she watched the city's reflection in the restaurant windows. Outside, a light rain began to fall again, as if the universe insisted on purifying what was left. Deep down, she knew that forgiveness wasn't for him, but for herself. Forgiving meant freeing herself from the fragile version that had once needed to disappear to be noticed. The weight of humiliation was gone. Only the lightness of someone who had found her voice again remained. As he got up to leave, the waiter casually mentioned that the place had a curious story about a former CEO who used to dine there with his wife, and that one day she disappeared without a trace. Soo-min smiled, a serene, almost imperceptible smile, and replied simply, "Some absences are the beginning of a new life." As she stepped outside, the night wind blew against her face, bringing a sense of complete freedom. But something deep inside her, an ancient, silent intuition, told her that fate had not yet completely finished what had begun at that very table years ago. A few months had passed since that night at the restaurant, and the name Yoon Tae-jin, once synonymous with power and ambition, was now just a faded memory in the archives of the financial market. His empire had been absorbed by other companies, his former allies had gone their separate ways, and the luster that had once surrounded him had dissipated like smoke in the wind. Living far from the spotlight, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Incheon, he spent his days in silence, watching the sunrise and sunset through the same window that once reflected his arrogance. The expensive suit had given way to simple clothes, and the folders of contracts had been replaced by stacks of books and newspapers no one read anymore. Yet amidst the solitude, there was something different about him, a resigned calm, as if he finally understood the value of what pride had made him lose. One morning, while walking through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, he spotted a crowd gathered outside an auditorium. Curious, he approached close enough to read the illuminated sign, Che Group, Corporate Innovation and Empathy Conference. He smiled slightly, a tired smile, and stood for a few moments watching the excited people enter. From inside the building, the sound of applause echoed, and a firm, calm female voice dominated the room. He recognized her immediately. Even without seeing her, he knew it was Soo-min. He stood on the sidewalk, under the cold wind, listening to the distant echo of her words, which spoke of purposeful leadership and the importance of recognizing the invisible value of others. Those phrases, so simple and true, seemed to reach across time and touch something inside him that still pulsed, however faintly. For a moment he considered entering, approaching, asking to see her again. But he understood that his presence no longer had a place in the world she had built, a world where he was merely a memory, an example of what the ego can destroy. He walked slowly down the street, leaving the sound of applause behind. He felt the cold air on his face and closed his eyes. For the first time, he accepted his own invisibility, not as punishment, but as a silent lesson. He understood that some stories don't end with reunions, but with acceptance, and that sometimes disappearing is the purest form of redemption. That night, back in his small apartment, he watched the lights of Seoul in the distance. He took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote just one sentence. Seeing is a privilege that love grants. Losing is the price that pride exacts. He folded the paper and tucked it into a book, as a reminder that fate does not destroy. It only gives back. And as the city lights reflected in his tired eyes, Yoon Tae-jin finally understood what Soo-min always wanted to say. Being invisible sometimes is the only way to learn to see. If this story touched something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel now and continue following. New stories of love, loss, and redemption. Here, each episode is a mirror of the soul, and each story proves that time always restores what the heart has forgotten to value.